Namaste everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host Kushalmehra. All right. So I have hosted a number of discussions on the Aryan immigration, Aryan migration, Aryan invasion, and the out of India theory. And I just came across a few days ago about the news about Dr. Koenraad Elst coming to Mumbai. So Shrikant Talageri sir reached out and said, Dr. Koenraad Elst is over here, and I wanted to make most of the opportunity to talk about it. So just to give you a brief background about what we're going to be doing today, if possible, we're going to be covering two presentations, but we would start with one. Dr. Elst has made a presentation about the Aryan linguistics and many other facets of the case. There will obviously be many questions also that I have prepared that I'm going to be asking to both Dr. Elst and Shrikant Talageri sir. But before I start with the presentation, I want to take this opportunity to welcome both Shrikant sir and Dr. Elst. Thanks a lot for coming. So Dr. Elst, let's start like this. I'm going to put the presentation up now, and first we'll go through the presentation. You can take us through the presentation, and then maybe we can address a few questions. Obviously, Shrikant sir, whatever questions you or comments you also have while the presentation, you can make them too. So I'm going to start putting the presentation up now. All right, let's start. Okay, so Dr. Elst, all yours.
Right, here we go. So we're going to talk about the linguistic evidence in the Homeland debate. It all started as a linguistic question, namely where this language family, Indo European, originated. So for a long time, there was no archaeological or genetic aspect to it. It was purely a linguistic issue. So we're talking about Indo European. This is a family comprising most North Indian and most European languages. Some people in India don't like the whole concept because it means splitting some Indians from others, and it means uniting some Indians with some foreigners. Well, nevertheless, that's what linguistic evidence shows. So these misgivings, I think, are no real objection for linguists. And anyway, even politically, they're not real objections. You see, it happens in many countries that languages of different provenance simply live together under one roof. So it shouldn't be an issue.
All right. So, sir, I just wanted to start with this. So if you could basically draw a baseline also, that what are the two different cases when it comes to the Aryan invasion or the Aryan migration case?
Well, migration there was in any case. No, except that some Hindus think that there was no migration at all. You see, they object to an immigration into India and just as much to an emigration from India. They see that as a ploy of the foreign hand. If they can't immigrate into India, then they still want to have a finger into Indian matters by having emigrated from India. So they don't like it either way. Well, sorry for them, but the existence of an Indo-European language family necessitates logically that it originated either in Indian territory or outside of Indian territory.
All right.
And so there's either an emigration or an immigration. To speak of the Aryan migration theory, as some do, is rather nonsensical because there was a migration anyway. You don't need to theorize that. There was either migration into or out of India. But so immigration theory, that is a term I can accept instead of invasion, in the sense that an invasion is also an immigration, though a military one. But the result is that people immigrate.
All right. So I guess I'll go to the next slide now. So what are we looking at over here?
Well, this is exactly what the Indo-European language family amounts to. So it is practically all of Europe except for Finland, Estonia, Hungary, and then some parts of Russia, and then Iran and most of India, plus Sri Lanka. But not the south of India, which is Dravidian, and some pockets in eastern India, which is Munda, a language family related to Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what we use here is the comparative and historical method of linguistics. And so even though Indians pioneered the science of linguistics thousands of years before it existed anywhere else, this is a part of linguistics that they didn't know about.
Mm-hmm.
You see, Panini taught in Taxashila, which is more or less present-day Rawalpindi, which is very close to the Iranian language area, where they speak Pathan, very close to the Burushaski area, very close to the Tibetan area, yet he writes nothing about these languages. So as an astute linguist, he must have known about them, but he confines his writing to comparison between standard Sanskrit and the adjoining Prakrits. And so these, comparing with other language families, he doesn't do. Also, the history, well, you see, he knew the language of his time. There was no ancient literature yet that he could compare with. So, you see, those are new things. That is something that Indians have to accept. There, the West has made a certain contribution, namely by developing this comparative historical method in the 19th century.
So Dr. Elst, what would you say to those objections raised by people that comparative linguistics itself is a flawed hypothesis, and the Proto-Indo European language hypothesis itself is flawed?
Yes, I've heard that many times, but not from people who know linguistics. So in India, you have the situation that, first of all, there are very few linguistically capable people. There are, of course, many polyglots who studied Pashto and Malayalam and so on, but who have never studied the comparative historical method. And it's also because of the social situation in India. All talented youngsters are pressed by their parents, oh, go for engineering, go for medicine. And so the few people who write about linguistics are engineers who later in life also feel like explaining whatever they think about linguistics. So often it is incompetent, sometimes it is competent, but even then it is missing some things that you could expect from professionals. So that's a hiatus in Indian intellectual culture.
Yeah, but sometimes, in fact, it's very interesting. I had read somewhere, even Shrikant sir, you were accused of being too westernized in your understanding of how linguistic works. And if I remember correctly, someone had accused you of being a Protestant. So they had accused him of being colonized when it came to this whole Proto-Indo-European hypothesis. So what would you say to that?
Now, I don't know on what basis they are saying westernized, because everywhere I have used the actual text and the actual Rigveda. I have not used Western people's interpretations or something like that, or I analyzed the Rigveda using the Bible or something like that. So what I'm doing is actually analyzing the data which is there in the text. Like I say, this word is there so many times. This word occurs here or that. This word is not found. It is found in a certain part of the Rigveda. These are, actual facts which you can check out in the text. There's no Indian or Western or Chinese and all this. You're actually analyzing the text. It is not a question of what your attitude is or which viewpoint you're looking at it from.
Fair enough. So let's go to the next slide now. Yep. So the Uralic model.
Right. So contrary to what some people in India assume, the Indo European model was not invented as some trick by the colonialists or something. No, it was an emulation of another model that already existed, which is the comparative and historical linguistics of the Uralic family. So this contains Estonian, Finnish, and Hungarian, as well as some languages in Russia, and ultimately Samoyedic, some languages in Siberia. And there is no racial angle to that. They're all white. Also, the scholars who studied it were white. There's no imperialist angle to it. It was just linguistics. And in a few decades, they had mapped out the entire family, shown exactly what the relations were. So that was a success. And so that appealed to people who had the impression that there was something similar between Sanskrit and Greek. And so then that was worked out in more detail. That was a far more ambitious project, and it turned out to work just as well.
All right, fair enough. So we go to the discovery of the Indo European language family.
Yes,
itself.
so there was already a certain suspicion in a few travelers from Europe to India. And that was then systematized in 1767 by a French Jesuit living in India, namely Gaston Laurent Coeur-Doux. So him you could more or less call the father of the Indo-European language family. Then his findings were soon commented on by the French intellectual Voltaire, and made school quickly in Europe, where the spirit of the times was quite pro-Indian. You see in their Enlightenment search for an alternative to Christianity, they liked the idea of some Indian ancestry. Then in India itself, in 1786, it was the judge, Sir William Jones, who made this whole thing public. You could call that perhaps the official birth of Indo-European. And from then on, it was the craze. You see, very many intellectuals started working on it. They call this family Indo-Germanisch in German, or Indo-European, or indeed Aryan. The word Aryan already existed. It was introduced by Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil Duperron. In the 18th century, he is considered the father of Orientalism. But he used the word Aryan in the sense of Indo-Iranian. So the Iranians and the Indians were involved, not the others.
All right.
So here, Friedrich Schlegel, who was a great Indo-maniac who greatly praised India, used the word Aryan in the sense of Indo-European. So Germans, Celts, Russians, and so on, they were all part of it.
All right.
Now the question is whether this is really a language family. And so this has been contested greatly in India, where people say, yeah, but you see, Tamil also contains many Sanskrit words, so it is cognate. Well, it is not. Japanese contains many English words these days, or many Chinese words, already much longer. It is cognate neither to Chinese nor to English.
Got it.
And so the situation is that Sanskrit is cognate with foreign languages like Latin and Greek. It is not cognate with Tamil, though it has had an enormous influence on Tamil, which is something else. And so, I could give you the Indo-European textbooks that explain all this. This is not going to convince any Indian who, has it in for the ugly, evil foreigners. But I can advise you to read Shrikant Talageri, who has nicely explained this whole situation.
So maybe this is a perfect segue. So Shrikant sir, maybe you can explain this whole thing about whether there is a language family or not, because as you know, आपको पता होगा कि many times this has been raised that there was no such thing as a language family itself.
Yeah.
So could you briefly touch upon that?
Yeah, this is very like the usual example that we give is English father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, and the Sanskrit equivalents are Pitar, Matar, Bhratar, Sosar, Sunu, Duhitar, and the Persian are Pidar, Madar, Biradar, Khosar, Hunu, Dukhtar. So you see, it's so obvious. But now or numbers. If you take, for example, you take the number 3. And you find it in all the Indo-European languages practically. In fact, in Persian, it is becomes C, but otherwise it is 3 everywhere. Now, numbers and relation words can be borrowed by one language into the other. For example, while speaking any Indian language now, we so often use English numbers or we call people uncle and auntie when we are talking in Hindi.
Yes.
So these words can be borrowed, but certain words cannot be borrowed, like personal pronouns like I, you, we, she. When we are talking in Hindi, we'll never use those words. So, and when we see English and Avestan and Sanskrit, for example, in Sanskrit, Vayam and Yuyam, no modern Indo-Aryan language has words like that, and English has we and you, Vayam, Yuyam. So that is the degree of similarity. And if we can accept that modern Indo-Aryan languages are related to Sanskrit, you have to accept that English is related to Sanskrit. And then there are certain words which are so extremely striking. Like, in English you say, I am, thou art, he is. So am, art, is. The Sanskrit words are asmi, asi, asti. And the Avestan words are ahmi, asi, asti. Ahi, asti. And the Greek words are emi, esi, esti. The Russian and Lithuanian words are esmi, esi, esti. Now you will see that, for example, Russian and Lithuanian, you just get them from the Sanskrit word by changing A into E. Asmi, asi, asti becomes esmi, esi, esti. So these are modern Russian and Lithuanian, whereas Sanskrit is an ancient language. Yet through the years, through the centuries and across thousands of miles, the words are so exactly similar. Whereas if you see modern Indian languages, in Hindi you will say hu, hai, hai. In Marathi you will say ahe, ahes, ahe. In Gujarati you will say chu, cho, che. In Konkani we will say asa, asa, asa for all three. So if you see Kannada, you will say iddene, iddi, iddane. In Tamil you will say irukiren, irukirai, irukiran. You see, even neighboring languages today have such strikingly different words. So when you see that Russian, Lithuanian, ancient Hittite, ancient Greek, Avestan and Sanskrit have these three words almost like each other across the, as I said, the years and the distance. And these words are never borrowed, as I said. You cannot use the English am, art, is when you are talking Hindi, or the Hindi hai when you are talking English. So this shows the deep-rooted connection between these languages.
All right. So obviously, Dr. Elst, your passing remark over here is Sanskrit is much closer to Latin than to Tamil. Obviously, you're going to raise a lot of rankles there. All right.
About the out of India theory.
Yes.
Well, it is very often said by advocates of the Aryan Invasion Theory that this is a concoction, recent concoction by Hindu nationalists.
Yes.
And it isn't. The out of India theory is as old as the notion of Indo European. You see, the very first suspicion when they discovered this kinship was that the land of origin was India. You see, the role of Sanskrit in discovering and establishing this kinship was enormous. Sanskrit was clearly older than Latin and Greek. And so at first they thought, well, maybe the language of origin is Sanskrit itself. Later that was nuanced a bit. Sanskrit was close to it, but it had already somewhat evolved from Proto-Indo European. At any rate, it was older, it was closer, and so they thought, well, the homeland must have been in India or very close to it, maybe Afghanistan. And so that was the official theory for the first more or less 70 years, till about 1840. So you see, those people who say, oh, you've all invented it, Hindu nationalism and so on, they just don't know their history. Now, incidentally, I am all in favor of not knowing your history in this regard. You see, if you want to decide what happened 5,000 years ago, then it's better not to talk about what happened the last 200 years. Way too many polemicists on both sides are always busy with, oh, Max Müller this, and William Jones that, and so on. I just don't want to know. You see, what intrigues me is what happened 5,000 years ago.
Exactly.
So anyway, the big name here is Friedrich von Schlegel. In 1808, he set it out very explicitly, but it was already in the air. The idea that India was the land of origin. Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, Johann Herde, the historian Jules Michelet, they all thought so. And so it is only in the 1830s that the idea of a homeland in or around the Caucasus comes up. And so then there are some rearguard arguments in favor of the Indian homeland, but in about a decade's time, that goes out of fashion. And so then the Aryan Invasion Theory starts.
All right. Now the birth of Indo European scholarship.
Yes, so this is usually identified with the comparative conjugation handbook written by Franz Bock in Berlin in 1816. A few years ago in Berlin, there was a celebration of the 200th anniversary. And then he continued with comparative grammar and so on. So he put Sanskrit in the whole map of all the Indo European languages. And so from there on, it starts, many others take over. And so they start reconstructing this mysterious language, Proto Indo European, that must have existed. Now, some Indians dismiss it. Oh, it's a ghost language. It never existed. Well, it certainly existed. Only we have a hard time defining it precisely or describing it. You see, if you exist, that proves that your grandmother existed. Now, you may not have a photograph of her. You may not have a description of her. You may not know anything about her, but you know very sure that she existed. So this Proto-Indo-European language, even though we are still looking for what exactly it looked like, certainly existed.
Now, I have a question here, Dr. Elst,
Yeah.
and maybe for both of you. This question is for both of you. Now, when it comes to the Proto-Indo-European dictionary, so from whatever I have understood, I've tried to read a few linguists, and I tried to read David Anthony too. They say the construction of the Proto-Indo-European vocabulary or the dictionary, where the words, is based on where and what they found in the Eurasian steppes. So, I found this here. So this is more likely to be the Proto-Indo-European word. One of the classic cases being the Proto-Indo-European word for horse. Is basically constructed directly from what they found in the archaeological excavations in the Eurasian steppes. So how much, or do you think, of an impact would that kind of a built-in bias, if I was to use the word with a lot of trepidation, have in the construction of the whole set of words in PIE itself?
Well, it is very difficult to connect archaeology with language. Some cases are convincing, like the fact that in the whole of the Harappan culture with many cities, you don't find any archaeological trace of an invasion. Whereas the speakers of Indo-European were clearly different from the speakers of the Harappan language, or at least that's what all the invasionists assume. And so they don't find any archaeological proof of their theory. Now, was there more of it in Central Asia or in Eastern Europe? Let me remark, first of all, that writing in Eastern Europe is really 4,000 or 5,000 years younger than the supposed presence of the Indo-Europeans in that area. So to say that we have proof, I don't know. You see, we find archaeological traces of ancient populations. What language did they speak? Well, big question. And so archaeology has a role to play in this search, but limited. And so what these people say about archaeological proof of Indo-European in Ukraine, Russia, I don't know. Let's consider that, but I mean I wouldn't be too quick in using the word proof.
All right. So, Shrikant sir, I had a question for you. obviously, Conrad, Dr. Elst has also mentioned this about the Malayo Polynesian links.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit of that too?
Yeah. Now, see, Malayo Polynesian, they, for example, you see when people talk about Indo European and Semitic connection, they take one number for 7, which they say is similar. Now, why would two languages develop the number 7 in common and all the others different? Whereas if you see Malayo Polynesian and Indo European, the very first 4 numbers are similar. Like
Fascinating.
in Malay language, for example, Dua and Tiga. If you ask any Hindi person what must these two numbers be, what will they tell you? 2 and 3. He doesn't have to know Malay to know that. So you see how similar they are, but people, because they don't want it to consider this, they reject it as unlikely. And when they want to, they even take very unlikely connections and try to connect the words. So it is not an honest way of doing studies, in my opinion.
But the real importance of this suspicion is that he makes a link between the original Proto-Indo-European language and a language situated elsewhere. Now, if you want to say that Indo-European originated in Europe, then it would be helpful if you can find a European language that is somehow linked with this Proto-Indo-European. Now, there is no such. In fact, there is no original European language. You see, we have Basque in Europe, which probably comes from Northwest Caucasus. We have Uralic, which comes from beyond the Urals. And then we have Indo-European, of which I argue that it comes from India, but of which at least most others argue that it comes from Russia, on the far corner of Europe. So most of Europe has no language of its own, or there were, but they are extinct. And so we don't satisfy that criterion of finding some related language in Europe, whereas we do find some such language in the East. We have more ever since. There is this Russian linguist, Igor Tonoyan Belyayev, who identifies a number of words in common with Tibetan. So who shows that Proto-Indo-European was a neighbor of Tibetan. There is also a theory by some Romanian linguist, Chazule, who tries to show that the Burushaski language, spoken in Pak-occupied Kashmir, is essentially Indo-European. Now, this case is not convincing at all. However, the few examples that he tries to give of recognizably Indo-European words in Burushaski may have been borrowed words. And there you see again, these words are Proto-Indo-European of the Western variety, of the Canton variety that ended up in Western Europe. So that seems to suggest that the origin, even of that Western variety, was in India.
Interesting. All right. Now we go to the later development.
Yeah. So now we start developing the Aryan Invasion Theory. So the homeland shifts westwards.
Mm-hmm.
There is a recent PhD in Belgium, Marianne Keppens, who has identified in her thesis about the Aryan invasion question, I think 2 papers from 1810 or so that already suggest a more westerly homeland. At any rate, at that time, the Indian homeland was generally accepted. It's mainly in 1834 that August Schlegel, who is the brother of the Indomaniac Friedrich Schlegel, who thought India was the homeland, he posits a homeland outside India, somewhat convincingly, namely in the Caucasus. Now, the Caucasus Mountains is not a demographic growth area, but just north of it, you have the steppe landscape. And so it might have been there. And indeed, that's where most people still situate the homeland till today. By the way, this becomes a factor in the racialization of the whole Indo-European theory. So that's what many people in India still identify it with. So you later get this notion of an Aryan race, Now, that was helped along greatly by the fact that there was a theory at that time that located the origin of the white race in the Caucasus Mountains. This was started by Johann Blumenbach in about 1800. In America, they call white people Caucasians, and that's because of this. And so, if you say that both the Indo European language family and the white race originate at the same place, well, some people are bound to link the two and then identify the Indo Europeans with the white race.
All right. Now, so there was. I actually was not aware, as you talk about it in the slide. So there was a defense for OIT too.
Yes, exactly. You see that what we are doing now was already done. In
I'm actually shocked
1841.
when I read this. I was shocked because
Yes.
obviously you had sent this to me. I was going through it. I was like, wow.
Yeah, well, when the Caucasus Homeland Theory started, then some people teaching Sanskrit in India, Europeans teaching in India, took up the defense of India as the homeland. The factor India is important to note here. Why? Well, you see, if you use the Mercator projection on a world map, you see the Mercator projection preserves the angles but is not faithful to the surfaces. And so areas closer to the poles are magnified enormously. Areas close to the equator are rendered much smaller. So if you're used to that kind of map, as most people were until recently, then India is a very small place, much smaller than Scandinavia, for example. Whereas in reality, of course, it's as large as Europe as a whole. And so inside Europe, people started neglecting India. In fact, there's a book about this, L'oubli de l'Inde, the forgetfulness about India, where India in the 18th century took a central place. In the 19th century, it was relegated to the sidelines more and more. This also had to do with its political status. From a rich, mysterious country in the distance, it became a mere colony. And so it was easier to neglect. And so it didn't figure anymore in considerations of the homeland. However, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who was a colonialist par excellence, who had been the governor of Mumbai presidency. Later in life, he wrote a history of India, in which he says very explicitly that in the classical Hindu writings, there is no mention at all of coming from elsewhere. And there is no reason at all for thinking that the Hindus ever inhabited another country. So, to be sure, in many of the other branches, there is also no memory of another country, but that is easily explainable in the sense that the time between which, let's say, the Germanic people arrived in Germany and the time when they committed their traditions to writing, there's thousands of years between that, long enough to forget. And even then, there is a tradition, just one line in the Edda that says that they came from Asia. So even then, there is a notion of immigration. Well, that's not there in the Vedas or in the Manusmriti or in the Puranas. There are stories about immigration from India. So that's an argument that is still being used, but that was already used by Mount Stuart Elphinstone.
All right.
And another argument he uses is that, you see, some people clearly at that time already are swayed by the notion that this steppe homeland lies nicely in the middle. They went to the Atlantic and they went to the Bay of Bengal, and that's about the same distance. Well, interesting, but that's just not how it goes in reality. You see, Russian, for example, has expanded from what is now Ukraine, that's where it started, Kiev Rus, and it went all the way to the east, like 10 time zones, all the way to Alaska. Mm-hmm. And it didn't go west at all. Of course, Russians individually migrate to the west, but there were already established Polish, German, and so on languages, and so they adapted. They couldn't establish Russian there. The same thing with Arabic, which moved from Arabia all the way to Morocco, westwards and not eastwards. The Bantu languages started in West Africa, Nigeria or so. They moved all the way to South Africa, and they didn't move north at all. And you can easily see why. You see, the Bantus were so successful demographically because they were the ones in Africa who started with agriculture. Now, agriculture you can practice almost anywhere in Africa, but not in the Sahara Desert. So they didn't move north, they only moved south. And this exemplifies how the reasons why people migrate are not symmetrical. So you shouldn't expect a symmetrical migration. And so it is very logical. It is rather probable that they start in one far corner, in this case, India, going all the way to the Atlantic.
Fair enough.
See, so, there is a certain inertia in people's minds that make them assume this symmetry. And so this culture, the pit grave culture, or in Russian, the Yamnaya culture, that's located in Russia, Ukraine. Now, the recent insight, both from linguists like Paul Haggerty and from geneticists like David Reich, is that was indeed an important center. Indeed, that's where the Indo Europeans entered Europe from. So looking from Europe, that could look like the homeland. However, it's only a secondary homeland. So there they settled in large numbers, coming from somewhere else again. Like in India, for example, when David Reich published his book a few years ago, many invasionists ran away with it, saying, oh yeah, you see, he proves our theory that the origin was in South Russia. Well, no, he doesn't. He thinks that the origin was in northern Iran, and that then the Yamna area was a secondary homeland. So the origin was not in Europe, not even in Eastern Europe. It was in Asia and, well, fairly close to India already.
So we are already near the area of Iran and those particular areas.
So after it was no longer India, the homeland could be located in many places. Some have even located it in Atlantis. Or it could be in Belarus, the Pripyat marshes. Bactria is closest to India. Anatolia has been a recent favorite in the 1990s. However, since the publication of the book The Aryans, Study of Indo-European Origins by Gordon Childee, Australian, in 1926, there has been a growing consensus for Southwest Russia. And this was given more body in the 50s by Maria Gimbutas, a Lithuanian refugee working in America. So she brought this narrative, which instantly became very popular, of the martial Kurgan culture. Kurgans means grave hills.
Grave pits or...
And so they were martial, they were masculine, they were warlike, and they overpowered the peaceful agricultural old European culture. The old European culture, by the way, is not really European. You had an influx of the first agriculturists from Anatolia into the Balkans. And so it must be those people that were overpowered by the incoming Aryans. Anyway, so there was a very good story about the ugly, vicious masculine Aryans overpowering the feminist old Europeans. And that scenario was then projected onto India. So in Europe, you have plenty of proof for this invasion. You have totally new pottery types, habitation types, burial types, and so on. You have new skeletons, new genes. You see that a new population comes in. All this stuff is totally absent in India. Yet, you see, this was projected onto India. So symmetrically, they overpowered Europe and they overpowered India.
Now, why is this gentleman so important, August Schleicher, if I call
Yeah, well, yeah, he is important, perhaps not so much known from the Indian side. He brought a few ideas that each of them are rather important. Um, he worked just after Darwin. Charles Darwin started this teaching of evolution, and so then that was applied everywhere. Like it was even applied to yoga by Sri Aurobindo. But so it was applied here to the life cycle of languages that have a birth, a time when they flourish, and then decay. Um, Part of that is the notion of an Indo-Germanic primeval people. So he says, if they spoke one language, it means that there was one community speaking the language. So that's the Urfolk, the primeval people. That, of course, has been heavily criticized recently in Europe by all the leftists who say, yeah, but you see, this is a Nazi notion and so on. Though Schleicher had nothing to do with that. And so they want to sort of dissolve the whole notion of nation. Yeah, well, and the next one is the next slide is really what he's known for. Namely, he writes a fable in Indo European as then conceived. So it's a story about a sheep and horses. So it sees the horses, either pulling a wagon for the human beings, or carrying a heavy weight for the human beings, or carrying a man, riding the horse. And so the sheep is commiserating with the horses. But then the horses say, well, you are no better than we, because your hair is being shorn by human beings and turned into clothes. So, I mean, that's the story. And so you can put that story into Indo-European as you can put it into any language you know. Now, the kind of Indo-European that he reconstructed has evolved since then, that you can see on the next slide. So the first version still looks very much like Sanskrit. Like, for instance, where you have ovis in Latin, you have avis in Sanskrit. So back then they still thought the Sanskrit form was the original. Nowadays they think that the Latin form was the original.
Fascinating.
Anyway, so you see this evolves the whole time. And so when new linguistic theories come up, that's one thing they always do. They take this story and put it into that new language.
All right.
Yeah. Then you have two theories, again by this Schleicher, the Stammbaum theory, which is the genealogical tree theory, which says very realistically that you speak the language that you learned from your parents. And so languages don't change a lot. They preserve what you have learned. However, there is then secondarily the Wellen theory, the wave theory by Johannes Schmidt, which emphasizes the horizontal changes in language. You speak a language, meanwhile you hear speakers of other languages. There are some expressions that you find useful and so on. You take over. And so your own language changes a bit, starts to contain elements that your parents didn't know about. And so that is also there, but I think secondarily. Anyway. Then you have a notion that explains the Indian situation. This is the so-called Sprachbund or Linguistic Area. That is to say, you may have different languages of different provenance, but because they are close together, they influence one another and they start resembling one another. So I am told by Indians that different Indian languages, including Indo-Aryan languages and Dravidian languages, are very similar. And in fact, this starts very early. The Tamil grammar, the Tolkappiyam, is a copy almost of Sanskrit grammars of those days. And so they consciously, you see, try to work to a similar model, and also simply by practice, the different languages come to resemble each other. So that's why some Indians say, oh, but all these languages are cognate. They are not. Nevertheless, they have influenced one another largely. And so they form what linguists call a linguistic area or Sprachbund. Then, we can't go into too much detail here. Then you have the Neogrammarians who try to give all the typical features of a science, of an exact science, to their linguistic reconstruction. So if you nowadays see manuals of Indo European, you have all these asterisks and accents and so on, that you have these people to thank for. And so one practical thing important here is that under their hands, Sanskrit moves ever farther away from Proto-Indo-European, which tends to justify the idea that the homeland was not India. And so India at that time gets definitively out of the homeland race. Well, here are a number of examples. So Dwo becomes Dwa in Sanskrit, Duo in Latin and Greek, Tu in Germanic. I mean, you can see all these similarities. Bharami, to bear, to carry, becomes a pharaoh in Greek and in Latin, or to bear in English, and so on. Let's, you can take a look at this, but it's rather obvious. Then another linguist, I only mention him here because he's important in the story. You may not get very excited about this. He's the father of so-called structuralism. And so he finds structures in language that show up things that you don't expect, like his main discovery is the so-called laryngeal sounds in Proto-Indo-European that don't exist anymore in any of the extant Indo-European languages, although it did exist still in the disappeared Hittite language, but there again we are more than 3,000 years ago. So these sounds are familiar if you know Hebrew or especially Arabic. The alif, the ha, and the ayin are these throat sounds, these laryngeals. So they must have existed in Proto-Indo-European as well. Anyway, that's controversial. I know linguists who say, "Oh, the infamous laryngeal theory," but most people believe in it. And so, in 1914, they discovered Hittite, which turned out to have these sounds. So it was not so fanciful. And this shows, of course, that it really is a scientific thing. A good scientific theory predicts. And so he predicted the finding of these sounds, and that effectively.
So basically, what he did, to be more clear, he basically took a backward integration approach. He broke the words down and he took them back, and this is most probably how they would have developed.
Right. Yeah. Then there is the matter of demographic common sense. If you look at the map, at the demographic figures, it's obvious that India is a giant. And moreover, it was culturally more advanced than these wild riders of Central Asia. And so it easily absorbs and assimilates invaders, as it has done all through its history. And if there are immigrant groups from India, they may be a small minority in India. When they come into Central Asia, they suddenly are a large dominant group because that's far more thinly populated. And so in Europe, there is no such giant as India was. You could compare it. You see, some people ask, okay, if these languages came from India to Europe, shouldn't we then find Indians in Europe? Now, we find some genetic relation between East Europeans and Indians, but not much. And this is easily explainable. Namely, the Indians came into Central Asia. There, somehow converted the local population to the Indo-European language. And so from then on, most of the speakers of Indo-European in that area were not Indian anymore. And then that group conquered Europe. This we can compare with something else on language, namely religion. Islam was transmitted by the Arabs to the Turks. The Arabs only had a very temporary little foothold in Sindh, the westernmost province of India. But the Turks conquered India repeatedly and large parts of India. And so the way that the Turks brought over an Islam that they themselves had borrowed, similarly, this Central Asian population must have transmitted into Europe an Indo European language that they themselves had borrowed.
Or in the case of Buddhism going outside India.
Yeah.
It's not like the Indian genotype
Exactly.
has traveled outside India.
Right.
I mean, Buddhism has also traveled all over the world.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not like you have Indian DNA in all those Buddhists.
Mhm.
Today, in the West, you have Buddhists too, right?
But so genetics is such that nevertheless you can find a little bit of traces of emigration. And so you do find some genetic similarities between East Europeans and Indians. And more so at the level of the animals. You do find in the cows in Ukraine or in Syria a clear contribution of the India zebu cow. So the cow herds that the Indo-Europeans are supposed to be, they took their herds with them when they moved to Eastern Europe. By contrast, they never took their cows with them into India. The Indian cows don't have traces of the genes of the European cows.
Yeah. So what is this linguistic evidence that we are talking about?
Yeah, well, this is about the rootedness of words. So some people don't want to believe it, but I think it's pretty good. Sri Aurobindo in 1915 wrote that in other languages the word wolf only means wolf, whereas in Sanskrit, vrka is typically a form derived from the verb vrk, the root vrk, which means to tear, to pull apart. And so that gave me an idea. Yes, you see, there must be many words in Sanskrit that still have a meaning, that are rooted in the general vocabulary, whereas in the other branches, they have lost these roots and only mean what they mean. Only, they are an individual word. For instance, son. The son, the child, the male child, comes from a root su that you find, for instance, in Saviter, the sun god, meaning the procreator. So you have this meaning in su, to procreate, and then you have a derivative sunu. Now, in other languages, you just don't have that root anymore. You only have the resulting word son. Oh, for instance, pater, father, which becomes pita in Sanskrit, still has a root pa, which means to protect, which is probably the origin of this word. Often, and he gives a list of about 400 of words that in Sanskrit are rooted in the general vocabulary, whereas in the other languages they are just they fall from the sky, have no connections. Then there are the loanwords. So this is, of course, a field of study in its own right. For instance, in Germanic, they say there are about 30% of non-Indo-European words, which means they have borrowed it either from a substratum, a lower lying layer among the existing indigenous population that they found upon immigration. And so from them, they mainly borrowed words for landscape elements, for materials. Whereas they may also have encountered groups that were superior, and from them they borrowed mainly words for social organization. So that's true for Germanic, that's true for Greek. Greek has about 40% of borrowed words, which incidentally is a great contrast with Sanskrit, Vedic Sanskrit has practically no borrowed words. Later, of course, it becomes more as Sanskrit grows in surface and therefore comes in contact with more languages. Then it starts borrowing from Dravidian, for example, but initially it doesn't. And so the oldest Greek or Germanic that we know has a heavy dose of borrowed words.
All right, so I can ask this question over here now. Then, Shrikant sir, you can also answer this. So I have a question out of the list which I had given it
Yeah.
to you. So if I was to then, maybe ask this question, let me pull the question out and read it, because I think it makes sense with this current slide that we're talking about right now. So if this is the case, because we are under Loanwords, so historians say that the Middle Rigveda has many BMAC, Dravidian, Santali loanwords, which maybe are missing even in Iranian.
Yeah.
Then if the OIT is true, how do we explain that? Shouldn't that be the case that they should have retained at least something till the Iranian group then?
No, see, what they don't realize is that it is not a unitary original group which from which people departed away. Like it is the Purus who are the Vedic people. The Anus and Druhyus were to their north and west. So there is little chance of Dravidian influence on them or Austric influence on them. So those who went out did not have Dravidian and Austric influence. Even in the Rigveda, that influence comes only in the later parts when they became a high civilization and people from other parts of the country came and settled down there and all. And even more so, that was in Rigvedic times. But just 1000 years ago, the Romani people, the Gypsies, migrated out from India, from the Indo Aryan heartland. Yet they have not taken a single Dravidian or Austric word with them. So, do you deny that they went out from India? Whereas these people went out 4,000-5,000 years ago from the northwestern frontiers, which were far from the Dravidian and Austric areas. So, this very question is, ridiculous. Unless you are willing to accept that the Romani people, the language also did not go out from India, you have to accept that the European languages did.
All right. Now I'll go to the next slide. I just thought I would ask this question on the loanwords when we are on that subject. All right.
Right. Then you have the question of really foreign loanwords. You see, we would like to root the Proto-Indo European language in a milieu, in a landscape with other languages. Now, in the case of Europe, all these other languages have disappeared. We can't do that anymore. We can see in Germanic there are many loanwords. They must have come from some language, only we don't have that language anymore. Now, in the case of Proto-Indo-European, we seem to have loanwords from Tibetan, or Tibetan has loanwords from this Proto-Indo-European. At any rate, they were neighbors, which is what in North India they are. So, for instance, the word pugs, meaning cow in Tibetan, is only distantly related to the Sanskrit word pashu. But pashu itself comes from an original Indo-European word, which you see far better in the Latin form pecus, which means cattle. And that pecus is remarkably close to the Tibetan word pugs. So you may have this closeness of Proto-Indo-European with Tibetan. And so that would fill an enormous gap in the evidence for the out of India theory. There is no such evidence for the Aryan Invasion Theory, but so far there was also no such evidence for the out of India theory, unless, of course, as you say, there was a relation with the Austronesian or Malayo Polynesian language. But so here we have a closeness to Tibetan that is very, very, very significant.
Now, what about the absence?
Yeah, well, this is the case of the case of Dravidian, for example. So all those who say the Harappans were Dravidian and the Vedic people borrowed all kinds of cultural motifs from them. Well, no, in that case, they would have borrowed plenty of words, which they haven't. And so, Dravidian is off the short list of the possible languages spoken in Harappa, at least in their area. You see, personally, I think that Dravidian was spoken in the coastal area, coastal Gujarat, coastal Maharashtra, and was there gradually overpowered or gave way to Indo European speech, which they took over. But so in the Vedic heartland, no Dravidian.
All right. So, but what would be, so if I was to ask you in this case, what would make you change your mind in this scenario?
That is a very good question. Yeah, that's what makes a science, that you are willing to review your position because of new evidence. We could of course find these loanwords. We could find loanwords from other languages that we don't realize yet. Like, for example, in India you have a disappearing little tribal language called Nahali, which is spoken here in this part, in Maharashtra. And there's not much of it left. Now, who knows? You see, precisely because we have so little of it, maybe it conceals some treasure of ancient Nahali that proves quite close to Indo European. But it is very unlikely that we are suddenly going to find some manuscript with Nahali from 3,000 years ago. But in principle, this is possible. That's what you always have in historical disciplines. A really well-crafted, established theory can suddenly be shaken by one new discovery.
All right.
That may happen here.
So I actually, if you could explain this Proto Munda slide, and then maybe I can even ask Shrikant sir about the Witzel bit too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the photograph here shows Michael Witzel. He's a bit of a hate figure among Hindu nationalists. So I've met him several times. We had a pleasant talk. So nevertheless, I think he's mistaken. He says that the BMAC, which is here not the Babri Masjid Action Committee, but is the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex in northern Afghanistan, Turkmenistan. So that was a fertile area around the Amudarya, a population center, not like the Indus-Saraswati area, but still sizable. So some civilization may have existed there. And if the Aryan Invasion Theory is true, then those people ought to have come there first before entering India. And so they may have borrowed some words from the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. So he says that, for instance, about the word Ishtaka, which means brick. Now, that word exists in Vedic, but only in late Vedic. Whereas if they came from this area in northern Afghanistan, they should have brought that word with them, and it should be in evidence since the beginning.
So just to be precise, by late Vedic, you mean the New Rigveda, the later books, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And another word is Parsha. Now, Parsha exists in Greek, perse, which means a sheaf of grain. Like there's a Greek goddess Persephone, and you can analyze the words as meaning she who beats the sheaves. Anyway, but so that's not a borrowed word, that's an Indo European word. So you see, his handful of words supposedly borrowed from this BMAC culture, that doesn't hold up, I think. More interesting is his theory of para-Munda languages. That is to say, a number of words in Sanskrit that show the same structure of Munda, even though they are not attested in the Munda languages that presently exist. Now, Munda languages at present are spoken all the way east in Jharkhand, and not at all in the Harappan area or the Vedic area. But maybe at that time they were. But there must have been already some serious difference given the distance. And so what we find in the Vedas might be words with the same structure typical of that family of languages, but not exactly the words that we know from Munda. And so a classical example is Kumara, which means a young man. And so this seems to consist of a prefix ku and then a root mara. And so that follows a word pattern typical of Munda. So that could be true. And if true, that's not really a problem. You see, where they were, the Vedic people must have bordered on the language area of the Munda people. And so once in a while, some word may have been borrowed. Why not? It doesn't say anything against the nativeness of Indo European.
Fair enough. Shrikant sir, I actually wanted to hear your views on the same also.
About this Munda.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, this by making such an argument, they don't know how much they're putting themselves into trouble. Because, see, firstly, what I have shown about the old Rigveda and the new Rigveda, the massive data in the Rigveda, which shows that there is a gulf between two parts of the Rigveda, old and new. Now, all these words, if they are found in the old Rigveda, that means they far precede the Mitanni and the Avestan language, which belongs to the new Rigveda. So, which means that long before the Mitanni appeared in West Asia in 1750 BC, already the Rigvedic language, long before that, had these Paramunda words, according to him. Now, whether these words are Paramunda, because see, he says they are not actually attested in the Munda language, but they are structurally similar. But let us accept that they are Paramunda words. What it means is that already the Rigvedic people in the old period, long before the Mitanni appeared in West Asia, were so much naturalized in India that they had borrowed many Munda words as part of their vocabulary. This takes the dating chronologically far, far beyond any of the AIT dates for the invasion and automatically works against them. And even more peculiar is, that in the Mitanni names, apart from the names of the kings of the Mitanni, the only Mitanni name known to us is the name of Kikuli, the writer of the horse manual.
Yeah, the Kikuli
Now,
horse
if
manual.
his name beginning with Ki is also influenced by Paramunda words, then that only strengthens the proof that the Mitanni went out from India. They also have those Paramunda words which the Rigveda has. So it strengthens the out of India theory chronologically as well as typological, linguistically.
Got it. So now let's. This is a very serious issue. Linguistic paleontology. Dr. Elst over here too. When it comes to linguistic paleontology, there are many people who are doubters of this entire framework itself.
Yes. Yeah, so the arrival of linguistic paleontology in 1859 is one of the nails in the coffin of the out of India theory at the time, because that really seemed to prove that India could not be the origin, because a number of words existing since the beginning of Indo European seem to belong to the colder climate. Now, that's not really proof, because India has also islands of cold climate, namely the mountains. So India has wolves, bears, and other animals of cold climate, beavers, and so on. So it doesn't prove anything, but still, it's bad publicity for the out of India theory, let's say. But then, if you go look closer, you find that maybe there are hot climate animals in the old vocabulary, like ape is also a Germanic word, even though there are no apes in Germanic-speaking territory. Even elephants exist in Germanic, but with a changed meaning, namely camel. But you can see how when people leave elephant-rich territory to move to camel-rich territory, that the same word changes meaning, gets adapted to whatever fauna they find. So linguistic paleontology was very popular there, certainly played a role in this homeland debate, but it has gone out of favor precisely because when people change environments, they often change the meaning of words. And so the word may be retained but with a different meaning. Or a word may disappear but not prove that it didn't exist originally.
Got it.
So, I'd be very careful with this linguistic paleontology, although sometimes it has some successes to this credit. I'm sure that Shrikant will tell us about the elephant. But I'll add one more thing that I've thought about, namely the technology of wheels and carts. You see, there are 6 different words in Indo European that are attested in almost all the member languages for the parts of a cart. You see, axle, wheel, yoke. And this seems to mean that this was a Proto-Indo-European word that played a big role in the expansion of Indo-European. And I think it is because a wagon allows you to expand. You see, what happens numerous times throughout history is that a band of young men start raiding some city, even establishing an empire, but they marry the local women. And very often it is these local women who raise the children, and so their native language remains. And the conquerors lose their language. Like the Mongols, for example, under Genghis Khan, they conquered an enormous territory, of which, except for one little part in Russia, Kalmykia, you see, has disappeared everywhere. Nowhere do they speak Mongol. And like, for instance, in Persia, it's very well known. They adopted Islam, they adopted the Persian language, and so, of course, they remained in power, but they were not Mongol anymore. If by contrast, you do not have to do the conquering with just a band of young men, but you can take families along, they really implant the original language, the conquering language. And so that's what you could do with a wagon. You see, they had wagons just like, you see, the conquerors of the Wild West in America, they took their family along in a wagon. And so this existed already at the time. And so that made an impressive expansion possible.
All right. So Shrikant sir, could you actually explain the elephant example, as Koenraad sir has mentioned, words change meaning with the changing environment, in the case of the elephant and linguistic paleontology?
Yeah. No, that is true, because see, the elephant is recorded, the name, the common name. It is found in Hittite, Greek, Latin, and in Sanskrit. And also as a derivative name for camel, it is found in Slavic and Germanic. Now, this covers the full range from east to west, from ancient to modern. And the thing is, when people were migrating from India, they had to have migrated from India if they have a common word for elephant. Obviously, they could not take elephants with them through their northern migrations. So the thing is that this word is common for elephants and ivory. So obviously they took ivory with them, which is why in the northern languages you find that this word is not used for elephant, whereas the Greeks who migrated through the south and they were in contact with elephants throughout Africa, West Asia, etc. So they retained the dual meaning, ivory and elephant, whereas even Latin has retained only the word ivory, and so have the other Hittite. Because they went through the north, they did not actually take elephants with them. Now, another thing is about this linguistic paleontology. It is not only the early people, Indologists, who made this argument. Witzel makes it now. For example, about wolf, bear, etc. Now, the thing is, these scholars have got away with saying anything they want and no one questioning them. Now, let us take the example of bear. Does it show a northern origin? Because in the whole world there are around 8 species of bears, and Europe has only one, the brown bear. And to the north of Europe you find the polar bear. Whereas in India, you find 4 species of bear: the Himalayan black bear, the sloth bear, the brown bear, and you find the Malayan sun bear in Assam. And to the north in Tibet, you have the panda bear. So, how does this word bear show a northern origin? And when you go even deeper into it, you will see, you read Mallory's book, it is not I who am saying this. Mallory points out that the common word for bear in all the Indo European languages is from a root, riksh, which is what Koenraad has said, and what Kazanas has pointed out, that the roots develop into many words in Indian, in Sanskrit, whereas they are isolated words in the West. So this word bear is from a root which has not produced any other words in any other branch, but in Sanskrit it has produced words like raksha, rakshas, etc. Riksha for bear. So you see, when you go into any of their arguments, you uncover more and more evidence for the OIT, opposite to what they are intending it to show.
All right. So let's go now to the next one. Obviously. So
Yes.
So I will let you speak first for Shrikant Talageri.
Yeah, well, of course, when the out of India theory has gained its place, then all the textbooks are going to, forget about people like me, but they will certainly have to mention Shrikant. So, you see, he made a lot of, several crucial discoveries that then opened up the way for discoveries that some of us have made. But so the crucial work absolutely is his. About linguistic paleontology, well, you heard the example of elephant. I may also mention the example of horse. Some people think that the word for horse, again, proves a northern homeland. Well, it doesn't. And so some linguists have found that the pattern of the word for horse in Greek, in Latin, and so on, shows that it is clearly a borrowed word. You see, it has no stable morphology that, you see, follows all the rules for changing between one language and another. No, it seems to have been borrowed separately in each of the languages. Now, all of Europe and all of Central Asia has horses. And so to come from a land that doesn't have horses, well, that almost has to be India. So it's a very unexpected consequence of linguistic paleontology. So that's not a very strong type of argument, but for what it is worth, again, it does not disprove the out of India theory.
All right. So now we go to the isoglosses. Now this is a slightly technical one, Dr. Elst. Now I would request you to spend some time and explain this, because these are slightly complicated. Because I remember in my last discussion with Shrikant sir also, he had also said that the isoglosses are slightly technical. So maybe we should spend some time and break it down for people, what these isoglosses are exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, an example of an isogloss is a common change between two languages that proves that they were still together at the time when the change happened. Like, for instance, you have a word penque, which is the origin of Sanskrit pancha, meaning 5. And so that in Greek becomes pente. That's not yet a big difference. But in Latin and in Celtic, that initial p becomes qu, that assimilates with the next consonant. So penque becomes quenque, that becomes Latin quinque, and Irish coic. So that's one example of an isogloss. It proves that Latin and Celtic must have been still together after splitting off from Proto Indo European. They were still together before splitting off from one another and becoming real languages in their own right. So that is one of the few cases where linguistics may really say something about the homeland. This is important to note. I disagree with all these Indians who say that linguistics has nothing to say, but it is quite limited. It has a few things to say, but not much. And so that's what I learned at the time in university in my courses of Indo European linguistics, that linguistics is unable to prove the homeland. That at any rate, it hasn't proven the homeland. Proof of this is precisely that there are so many different theories. Some say it's in Anatolia, some say it's in Germany, Poland, some say it's in Afghanistan, and so on. So all these are compatible with the linguistic data. So here you see linguistics doesn't prove much. But you see, in the case of the isoglosses, sometimes it may prove something. So here it proves that Latin and Irish were together for a while, which is logical. You see, they started somewhere in Eastern Europe or Central Asia. They went west. They were together for a while until the Italic people branched off to the south, the Celtic people to the north or west. And then they became different. Now, there are some strange phenomena that have been not so much studied or that have been purposely kept in the dark. But you see, there are such isoglosses between Sanskrit, Iranian, Armenian, and Greek. Now, if you say that the homeland is in Russia, then it means the Greeks have gone west and the Sanskrit people have gone east. So they were separate already since the beginning. Whereas if they came from India, well, then it is possible that the Greeks remained there after the Germanics, the Slavs, and so on had already left. They still went through some changes together with Sanskrit, and then they left India. Like, for example, on the next page, you will see a few examples. Like, for example, there is an augment, that is to say a vowel in front of the root of the verb that indicates the past tense. Like, for instance, in Greek, leipo, to leave behind, yields elipon, I left behind. In Sanskrit, this vowel a becomes a, so you have adhat or agamat, gamma from the verb to go, to come. So agamat, he went. Then another one is the word ma or me, which means don't, which doesn't exist in Germanic, Latin, and so on. Or, for example, the changeover from S to H. This you find in Iranian. For example, in Sanskrit, you have the word sapta, 7. In Iranian, this becomes hafta, which has then found its way back into Sanskrit, or into, not in Sanskrit, but in, let's say, Urdu, hafta, meaning a week, a period of 7 days. And so you have the same thing in Greek, where, septa becomes a hepta. A heptagon means a polygon of 7 angles. So you see this continuum from Greek to the west of India. You see some of the Indian Prakrits also already have that tendency of changing S into H. Some people speaking Gujarati have given me a good few examples. Or, for example, even in Hindi, you have it very rarely, like the example I give there. Satar means 70, and 71 is not iksatar, but ikhatar.
Qatar.
Yeah, so very rarely you also have the same tendency. But so anyway, this is something that unites these, let's say, southeastern Indo European languages, and that indicate that Iranian, some Indo Aryan, Greek have gone through an evolution together, which is hard to explain if they left in opposite directions from a homeland in Russia. And so it is more parsimonious, simpler to posit an Indian homeland rather than a Russian one.
All right.
Well, this here is linguistically not important. It's just there in order to, well, convince the Indians that they should stop their prejudice against linguistics. And you see, India has a great history in linguistics, that they started it all. Like, for instance, the very first Sanskrit word that I knew, I learned in a class of Dutch diction, of properly speaking. So we learned about the sound harmony between succeeding words. Like, for instance, we learned that in standard Dutch, you say dat ding, which means that thing, okay? Dat ding, which means that the first word adapts to the second word. Dat ding becomes dat ding, voiced. Whereas in the Flemish dialects, you get the opposite combination, dat ding. So the dat retains its unvoiced characteristic, and the second word adapts, becomes unvoiced, whereas the consonant is originally voiced. Now, this phenomenon, I don't want to trouble you with Dutch linguistics, but the interesting thing is that this phenomenon of the adaptation of succeeding consonants was called sandhi. So the euphonic word link, which is so important in Sanskrit, and which is described in detail by Panini and the other grammarians, when they saw the linguists in the 19th century saw this, they said, oh, but this is very relevant. You see, this explains lots of things in Western languages. And so this became a standard concept in linguistics. So you see, it all started in India. So Hindus ought to have been the best linguists, but unfortunately, they started all this decolonization business. Saying, linguistics is a racist pseudo-science and so on. Okay, well, you see, to encourage them to take pride in Sanskrit linguistics, I'd like to mention to them that the periodic table of the elements by Dmitry Mendeleev was inspired by the perfect structure of the Sanskrit alphabet. You see, he saw that structure also at work in the word of the chemical elements.
Shrikant sir, actually, I have a question for you over here. As Koenraad, Dr. Elst has mentioned this, there is a lot of lambasting of linguistics inside the Hindu circles by calling it racist, pseudoscience, and people who promote it are called many things, which unfortunately includes you also by a certain section. So how do we convince them that everything is not a Western construct, and even if it is a Western construct, if it makes sense, it makes sense?
Now, this is something, I gave the example of Asmi, Asi, Asti, which becomes Esmi, Esi, Esti in Russian. This is so simple and direct that anyone should understand that such words are not borrowed, that they have to show relationship. But they refuse to accept it. But the thing is, that we easily blame Indians for not accepting linguistics. I myself have done so many times. But the thing is that the Western scholars blatantly and brazenly do the same thing without anyone questioning them. Like, for example, starting from Witzel to Sturman, there have been so many articles about the Dasharatne battle. In all of them, they say that it was a battle between Sudas and indigenous non-Indo-European, non-Aryan people. And yet, all the names of his enemies are either the names of Iranian groups on the Western front, or on the Eastern front, they are names of, Matsyas and means typical Sanskrit names. Not a single one of them is a non-Indo-European name. Yet none of them feels any compunction in treating this battle, which has nothing non-Indo-European in it, as a battle between Indo-European and non-Indo-European. All of them do it, and they continue to do it. No one asks them, how do you say that when not one of the enemies has a non-Indo-European name? No linguistic connection is there between Indo-European and non-Indo-European in this battle. So they do it brazenly and blatantly. They pretend that they are actually addressing a linguistic issue, but they blatantly and completely ignore linguistics when it is convenient to them. So, it is something that Indians should, as it is given here, Hindus ought to have been the best linguists. Unfortunately, Hindus think it is take pride in rejecting things, claiming that they are Western. Means I find it very funny that people who study in English, write in English, use the latest modern gadgets, and then when you use a scientific principle, they claim it is a Western one, like linguistics, and we should not use it. It's it's inexplicable.
All right. So the conclusion.
Well, it is a misconception, very popular, but a misconception, that linguistics automatically implies the Aryan Invasion Theory. That if you reject the Aryan Invasion Theory, then you have to reject linguistics. In fact, linguistics can be shown to support the out of India theory. Mildly, I don't think that is very solid proof, but anyway, what proof it contains is more on the out of India side.
All right. So now I get to the questions, sir. All right. So now we
Yes.
can get to the questions. Now I'll read the questions out. So maybe I'll start with this one first. So Shrikant sir, this maybe you can take this. So if the out of India
Yeah,
migration happened
yeah.
during Sudasa's rule, how come the Europeans have no memory of Indra?
Yeah.
So why is that the case then?
Well, Indians have no memory of any outside area, although the Rigveda is, even by Western dating, it is more than 3,000 years old. So, how can the other people who have written much later have memories? I mean, this is, when these people raise objections, they they're one way objection, that when that same objection is raised to them, they think it does not apply to them. It is like, as I said, when they say linguistics, they brazenly declare things as non-Aryan, even when there is no linguistic angle to it. So it is the same thing, it is, there is, main thing is there is no honesty in the debate. Anything can be there. If honesty is not there, there is no sense in any debate. We say AIT versus OIT debate, but is there a debate? Because we are answering every single point and objection raised by them, whereas they just continue to repeat the things without any compunction, and they don't reply to any of our points. Now, what I have given about the Mitanni vocabulary being new Rigvedic, that is something they have to address, but they continue on their way without addressing it. So I think, instead of a debate, what we really require is, like I say, the Ayodhya debate was going on, and they kept on maintaining that there was no temple under the mosque structure until the court gave the judgment after considering all the data. Now, they were saying there was no temple because they were refusing to look at the data. But when a neutral court, examined the data from both the sides, they arrived at the correct conclusion. Now, here these people can get away with, ignoring all the data and evidence we are putting forward. And because they are in control of the narrative in the media, in the academics, in political circles, so they can, promote their lies without any shame, or without any, trying to restrain themselves. So what we really require is, we have, I think, done all the debating part and presented all the evidence. Now what we require actually is a neutral judgment from a judicial group dedicated to this subject only. Now people will say this is not something that judges can decide, but given the data, they can decide it, like they did in the case of the Ayodhya. So I think, we have presented everything, and any new objection that there is also, we can immediately answer it.
All right.
The thing is that they are not acknowledging.
All right. So Dr. Elst, this is a two-part question, which
Yeah.
I'm going to be reading out for you.
Yeah.
So the first part is, if chariot invasions from north to south are implausible due to terrain, then wagons carrying families out of India would be equally difficult too, right?
No, not equally difficult. Perhaps difficult, but not equally difficult, because an ox-drawn cart going slowly is, after all, much less vulnerable than a horse-drawn chariot. And so, you see, the way Nehru describes, you see, in his discovery of India, he writes a letter to his daughter, invoking the big moments of Indian history. So he says, can you imagine, you see, the Aryans storming down from the Khyber Pass on their horses and so on? Well, yeah, I mean, that is really the Aryan Invasion Theory, in full glory. But, for warriors, to come down the mountains like that is far more unlikely than for, you see, peaceable families in wagons. But yes, I mean, I know, you see, about that. The last word has not been said, and I'm not an archaeologist. I mean, looking at the archaeological data, I imagine it like that. But you see, maybe experts have more to say about this. Meanwhile, your earlier question presupposes that the Europeans forgot about Indra. Now, there I disagree. They have another name for Indra. It's only the Hittites who have the name Indara, who is a goddess, but more is functional in the same field as Indra. But so you have Zeus among the Greeks and Jupiter and Thor, and they have the same role as thunder god. And so they have a lightning, a vajra, in the form of a hammer or something similar. And they are the same sort of persona. Indra is a very virile fellow who does all these great exploits. And so you learn the same thing about Zeus, who has all these lovers, and Thor. And so one thing, for instance, that they have in common, because of his great virility, Indra is lampooned precisely in that field. Like, for instance, and he also has a typical power of the thunder god in each of the Indo European branches, which is to take the shape of anything he wants, which later in India was philosophically interpreted as the doctrine of Maya, the world being a shape taken by the ultimate, and so being basically an illusion. Now, you see, Indra has the illusory shape of the husband Gautama, of the beautiful woman Ahilya, that he wants to seduce. So she's very faithful, she can't be seduced. So he takes the shape of her husband. And then you see they make love. She thinks that she's doing it with her husband, but actually he's cheating. Then later, when her husband finds out, he utters this curse over Indra. And so in different stories, there are different shapes of the curse. The one I prefer is that from now on, you will have 1,000 vaginas. And so all over Indra's body, suddenly you have these wet holes appearing. And so he goes to Brahma. He says, "Look, I look ridiculous. Is there nothing you can do about this?" And so he says, "Well, you see, if a Brahmin utters a curse, no, there's nothing you can do about it. But I might hide the effect, namely by putting an eye into each of these holes. Then you will be known not as Indra with 1,000 vaginas, but as Indra with 1,000 eyes." Now, you see, similar lampooning of the storm god's virility you find in the Greek version, in the Germanic version, and so on. Like, for instance, Thor has at one point lost his hammer. And so to recover it, he has to dress up like a woman. And so there are many, many similar details. He, of course, also, in this case, his son, who has the same characteristics, his son Siegfried, does the same thing. He takes the shape of, a woman he's lusting after, of her husband. He does it as if her husband, and then later, of course, it comes out.
So this is more of a comment, I guess. So if these ancient wagons would naturally be pre-horse driven, bovine driven, if we assume early Mandela migration, so wouldn't they also need then pre-existing routes, as it's not easy riding a wagon in the wild in that sense? So would this speak of a continuous bidirectionally connected populations going way back even further then?
Well, the wagon was invented at some point in history. It's not like fire that was invented maybe 300,000 years ago or so. They were too late to invent that one. But you see, the wheel was very new. I mean, there are cultures who, until very recently, didn't have wheeled vehicles. So that was new. And if you make new inventions, well, very soon they're going to be taken over by your enemies and by everyone else. Then the advantage it gives you disappears. But in the beginning, it's a tremendous advantage. And so for the Indo Europeans, it helped in their great expansion. And so by the time all the others had it, well, they were already expanded from the Bay of Bengal to the Atlantic.
Fair enough. Now, Shrikant sir, this question is for you. The oldest available Latin texts or linguistic data
Yeah.
are in the same time frame as non-Sanskrit Prakrits, right?
Yeah.
For so the Maharashtra, Satavahana poetry and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So would inclusion of Indian Prakrits as part of the data of
Yeah.
the construction of the Proto-Indo-European vocabulary itself
Yeah.
add value, or it's just more noise in the entire
No,
reconstruction?
but then for that you have to have linguistic acumen to know which can be really part of the original vocabulary, which has not been found in the Vedic literature, but it is found in the Prakrits in the East. Because some of them may be later words, some of them may be borrowed from other languages, and some of them may be original Indo-European words which are there in other Western branches but not in Vedic. So that I can't give a blank answer, because only a linguist who can really study this honestly and impartially, he will be able to do this. But definitely these languages contain many words, and I have given, for example, some scholar named Norman who has studied these words from the Prakrits, and he says that there are many words in the Prakrits of the East which are found in European branches but not in Vedic. Then similarly, there are many things, like for example, as per their theory, three Indo-Aryans and Iranians came from Russia, the steppes into the East, leaving behind many things which they did not bring with them. For example, the Kentum words. And yet we see that there is Bangani here, there's Tokharian to the north. Then there must have been other words which, for example, as Koenraad has pointed out, the word for cow borrowed by Tibetan is a Kentum word. So there are many things like that. Another thing is, for example, a common word for sea. I have written an article on that also. It is not found in any of these branches. That word is found only in the 5 European branches and in Hittite. And yet, this word is recorded by Panini in his Unadi Suktas as a word for sea. Now, where did he get this word from? Because it is not found in any Vedic or non-Vedic Sanskrit text. It is not found in any Iranian text, except in Ossetic, which is in the extreme west. So that must have been borrowed from there. It is not found even in Greek. Means, and at the time of Greek, certain words like Kendra, etc. were borrowed from Greek into Sanskrit, later Sanskrit. But Greek did not have this word also. So what it means is that the ancestral forms of many of the Western languages were there in India. They were not recorded, but they left certain clues, like this word mir, or like the Kentum features which are there in many unexpected places. So many things are, for example, also according to the theory, when the Indo-Iranians came from the West, there were originally 2 sounds in Indo-European branches of the West, L and R, and Indo-Iranian has merged them together. And yet we find that languages, dialects of the East within India have retained that distinction. How can it be? Because in Avesta, Rigveda and the Mitanni records have only R originally, and L only comes in the Rigveda from Eastern dialects, and then it is found in Eastern Prakrits. So which means that if you want to see the earlier forms before the Indo-Iranian group, you don't find them in the northwest or in the west, you find them deeper within India. So obviously, if the Prakrits are studied, it will yield plenty of information. But as I said, it requires experts. I am not one, so I cannot claim to be.
Fair enough. So, Dr. Elst, this is, I think the last 2-3 questions are more about from the work of David Anthony.
Yeah.
Now, in David Anthony's work, he puts a lot of importance on deriving. So let me draw the narrative. So what we see in David Anthony's work is the archaeological excavations in the Eurasian steppes and the area around that. They see certain patron-client relationship patterns or certain guest-host relationship patterns, which they try to connect it then with the Rigveda. So the question here is, if these features exist, are they unique to Proto-Indo-European or the Rigvedic societies, or to make it something out of the blue is a little bit of a far stretch, and they're just features you might find everywhere?
Well, I haven't studied all these other cultures in that respect, but generally, I certainly want to second the view that many things that were deemed typically Indo-European are much more widespread. Like, for example, you have Indo-European trifunctionality, which is a term by Georges Dumézil, which describes the fact that in Indo-European society, among the Celts, the Germans, and so on, you have three layers. You see the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. And they have symbol colors, white, red, and black, which are the same colors as in India, the Triguna scheme. And so, in my opinion, what you have simply is an application to society of the Triguna scheme, which is common to all Indo-Europeans. However, it's not only common to all Indo-Europeans. Like, for example, you have a Turkish myth about Boaz Khan, who he's conceived because his father is invited to some festival given by the king, and he finds that all men who have sons are housed in white tents, all those who only have daughters in red tents, and those who have no children at all are in black tents. And so he's housed in a black tent, and he realizes what is shame, and so he starts arranging that he and his wife have children. Now, you see there, you have a rather primitive conception of this division into three, where they are still linear. You see, white is all good, red is halfway, and black is down below. Whereas in the real Triguna scheme, they form a triangle. They're not upside down with one halfway between the others. No, you see the middle one, Rajas, the energetic pole, has something that neither the heavenly pole, white, or the earthly pole, black, has. And so it creates a dynamism. It creates a turning circle between those three. So you see that this basic idea of Triguna, of the three properties, is not exclusive to Indo-European, though it follows a certain evolution that is typical of Indo-European. Now, in terms of this comparative mythology, you find many cases where you have myths that are common to all the branches of Indo-European, but you also have myths that are common to not just Indo-European, but many others. Like, for example, in Indo-European, you have the myth that the world was created by twin brothers, one of whom kills the other one. So you have one called Mano, which becomes Manu in India, that kills Yemo or Yama. And so you find all kinds of applications. For example, Romulus founds the city of Rome, which is a world in miniature, killing his brother Remus, which is an assimilation to Romulus of the word Yemus, right? Or, for example, in Germanic, you have the killing of Yama, who there becomes Ymir, so that the parts of his body become the parts of the universe. Which is, by the way, a myth you find back in the Vedas, in the Purusha Sukta. You see, the Purusha Sukta has not only society, but also the physical universe come forth from cutting up of a human body. So the Purusha, his skull becomes the heavenly vault, his feet become the surface of the earth, his bones become the mountains, his blood become the rivers, his eyes become the sun and moon, and so on. So you have a similar a similar myth in many places, not only in Indo European. You find it all the way with the Mayas in Mexico. You find it with the Chinese, the myth of Pangu. So you see, many of these myths have taken a certain shape within Indo European, but really date back further. And so it's important to say this because in the 19th century, well, let's say till 1945, very much was made of Indo-European. This was the identity. They were the good ones. And so all kinds of things were deemed typical of Indo-European, whereas they are just human. And so they exist in other cultures also.
All right. So another question, and maybe both of you can take this. Do you accept that the citadel dwelling, copper mining Synthasta, were merely an extension of the Yamnaya from the Pontic-Caspian steppe? Or could they have been a different people altogether? Could they have been culturally and linguistically linked to BMAC and ISVC as sources of wealth, technology, and economic demand more deeply than to the Yamna-derived people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I don't know archaeology that well. Last year, I've followed a series of lectures by David Anthony. And so he assumed this Sintashta identification with the first chariots and so on, which I hear now is being challenged by Indian archaeologists or by Russian archaeologists even.
Yeah, Semenenko being one of them.
Yeah, right, who say that you see Sanauli near Delhi, that has real chariots, 2000 BC. Whereas at the same time, you would have them in Sintashta, but they're not real chariots. Anyway, I can't go into this discussion. It's interesting, but I don't know enough about it.
So, Shrikant sir, what are your views on the findings by Litor, Crowell, I don't know how to pronounce the last name, Gage, and others on that Synthasta chariot? Do you have any views on that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. It again shows the double standards, that what they have been tom-tomming everywhere, that, this chariots found there in Sintashta are the original chariots which were taken everywhere by
the because this new paper basically claims that they're not chariots, they could well be carts.
Yeah. So once that has been fixed as a dogma, then however weak it is still carried forward as if it is something, absolutely proven. And when they don't want to accept something like the present chariot found in Sanauli, then immediately they reject it, although it may be equally or even more likely to be a chariot than the Sintashta one. So it is not a question of what the facts show, but what they want the facts to show. As I said, I repeat, honesty is the only thing wanted. Like I also and Koenraad also, whenever we find something, what we had said earlier is not correct, we are willing to modify our this thing and accept the fact. But these people don't do it.
Fair enough.
Honesty is what is required.
Fair enough. One last question, and maybe I'll have to read a little bit to lay it down for you, Dr. Elst. So David Anthony makes a claim for the spread of Yamna peoples and culture, and hence Proto-Indo-European, from the Sredni Shog and Suvarovo Nova Danilovka areas to the entire Pontic-Caspian steppe in Europe, and even to the east of the east of the Urals. His claim is based on the occurrence of kurgans, even though the contents of these kurgans, which would be ceramic styles, grave goods, orientation of bodies, etc., they turn out to be completely different from region to region. I mean, the source is his own work, right? The horse, the wheel, and language. I mean, is he being conveniently reductive in order to claim that a homogeneous monolingual Yamna explosion in that sense spread Proto-Indo-European across this area? Or in other words, isn't it possible that the meme of kurgan building was adopted by many different ethnicities and linguistic groups without any wider cultural transfer, such as language?
Well, yeah, that is possible. And so it's hard to prove one way or the other because this is thousands of years ago in an area where we have no manuscripts or anything linguistic. So, I mean, all I can say here at this distance is that, well, this is possible. What I heard during his lectures was a bit of the new genetic evidence, where he shows that the people from Eastern Europe, these Yamna people, and people from Northwest India, and also people from Tuva, a part of Asia just west of Mongolia, they have the same genes. It's something like R1A, and there is a sort of road between Eastern Europe and India, which he thinks was traveled from Eastern Europe to India, though Indians show, I think, convincingly that this gene was older in India than in Eastern Europe. But anyway, he admits that there is no road from Eastern Europe to Tuva, whereas you see there are roads from India to Tuva and to Eastern Europe. So you see, he's honest in just noting that, and in fact, it goes against his theory that these people, both in India and in Tuva, came from the Yamna culture. Now, of course, he also probably assumes that evidence that is not there yet may in the future be found, but at least he admits, you see, there is no such evidence for the theory which I am proposing.
All right. So before we wrap today's discussion up, Dr. Elst and Shrikant sir, first of all, thank you very much. This was thoroughly educating for me. I learned a lot, and I'm glad that we could do this together. I know it was a bit of a rush, but we somehow managed to do it. But before we wrap it up, first you, Dr. Elst, and then Shrikant sir, any last parting words that you would like to say?
No. Nevertheless, I am rather optimistic about the progress here. You see, so far, the last at least 15 years, we've had an enormous stonewalling, a complete ignoring of our position by the opposite camp. And maybe I'm too optimistic, who knows, but I have the impression that cracks are appearing in this stone wall.
That's good to hear. Shrikant sir, any last words?
Yeah, see, what I want to say is that actually this is a subject which covers various scientific fields of study like linguistics, archaeology, and textual analysis. And now they have also introduced genetics into the debate. The thing is, that on every single point we have actually won the debate. But because there is no honesty, it is not accepted. So the whole thing becomes senseless. So the only thing that I want now is that there should be an impartial person who will evaluate both the sides and arrive at a conclusion. That I think is the only solution. We have nothing new to say. When they bring a new point, we have the answer ready. But if they don't acknowledge it, what can you do? Like even now, for example, everyone, I've seen so many people pointing out that people say your Talageri is not one whose articles appear in peer-reviewed journals. No, these are these peer-reviewed journals who say that Sudha's fought anti non-Aryan natives and all, when there is no scientific basis for that. So peer-reviewed journals has become a sort of wasila sort of thing. If you appear in a peer-reviewed journal approved by these people, they are the ones who will judge whether they themselves are wrong or not. So there is no sense in continuing a dialogue with such people, or even with many frankly idiot people within India who refuse to consider the case because they say no, those are professors in Western universities, they write in peer-reviewed journals. So who is this person? He's a bank clerk, he's something else, and they don't see the data. So the only solution in this thing is a judicial evaluation of the case from both the sides.
Well, fair enough. We'll see what happens. But this has been a fantastic discussion. Once again, thanks to both of you for coming over and chatting with me. I have learned a lot from you, as I was telling you. In fact, Shrikant sir has been on the podcast multiple times, and I have learned a lot from Shrikant sir. But I have to put this on record. Dr. Elst had written about negationism in India. I learned that term from him, And I was telling him today when I met him offline, and I told him that, he wrote the book about the negationism of the record of Islam in India. I told him I want to add to that, and I learned from him, and I added to that. Not only is there negationism of the record of Islam in India, there is negationism of the casteism and the behavior of Hindus and Indians in general about their casteist tendencies in India. So, Dr. Elst, once again, it has been a pleasure to meet you. And Shrikant sir, thank you very much. Guys, we'll end today's discussion over here. If you like what I'm doing over here, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave your comments. In the description of the podcast, there will be a link to Shrikant sir's blogspot and Dr. Elst's blogspot too. You will also find all the other social media handles to connect to Dr. Elst. I know Shrikant sir is not on Twitter, so you cannot connect to him over there. And please support the Cārvāka podcast by subscribing to the channel, going on Patreon or on YouTube, the YouTube membership, or buying the merchandise or sending your donations. I will see you next time. Until then, namaste, take care, bye bye.